So this video is on Chapter 8, Organizing the Body of Your Speech. So let's talk about the learning objectives for this chapter. We're going to construct an organizing question to identify relevant information. You're going to select an organizational pattern that's appropriate for your topic and your purpose. You're going to develop your key ideas using the 4 S's and then construct the 4 types of transitions to connect ideas to your speech. So fairly straightforward. The first thing you want to do is come up with an organizing question. When you've come up with your topic, consider the organizing question you want that's going to help develop your key ideas. So, for example, if I were doing a speech on how paper is made, my organizing question would be, what are the steps to making paper? Or if I were going to do an informative speech on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, I would say, what were the events that led up to and during the Kennedy assassination? So that organizing question allows you to construct your speech in a way that you can set up those main points. You can turn that then into your thesis. Your thesis doesn't have to be the exact organizing question that you've created for yourself. It can just be kind of your starting point, and then you can develop a thesis from that. It also suggests your pattern or your patterns of organization. So if I'm doing how paper is made, it's going to set up an chronological organizational pattern. If I'm going to talk about volcanoes in the world, and I say, where in the world are the most active volcanoes? That's going to set up a spatial organizational pattern for me. So it's going to, it's going to set up your thesis, and it's going to help you to determine what your organizational pattern is. So an example is, what does the National Holocaust Memorial Museum contain? And that would allow me to decide whether or not I'm going to use a topical pattern of organization. So I might talk about the different types of exhibits in the museum, or I could use a spatial. I could walk from room, I could take my audience from room to room or section to section in the Holocaust Museum. So again, that organizing question is very important. So one of the things we want to do is think about how we're going to divide our speech into key ideas. One of the things we've talked about in this class, or at least I've talked about and your textbook talks about, is the idea of audience analysis. Everything we do is geared to the audience. So if your audience is hearing your informative speech for the first time, they need some kind of a pattern that they can follow. So organizational patterns give your audience a way to kind of follow your speech. So if they know, because of your preview of your main points, that you've set up a topical division or a chronological division, then in their minds, they are following along using that pattern. So for example, the most likely pattern you will use will be a topical division. This is organized by aspects or subtopics. So if I wanted to talk about different types of coffee, I would organize my speech into, medium roast, dark roast, light roast. Or if I wanted to talk about the different types of diabetes, I might start with type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, then gestational diabetes. So topical division allows you to take your topic and break it up into simply subtopics that are fairly equal and balanced with each other, because we always want to remember that coordinate and subordinate principle of outlining. So topical division is one option. And again, go back to your textbook because they have a really good discussion of what topical is. Chronological is organized by time. So this is going to be a step-by-step process. If I were talking about how paper is made, I would use a chronological division. I would say first, we collect the pulp from the wood. Second, that pulp is processed. Third, and so on. If I were going to talk about an event, let's say the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980, I might use a chronological division. What were the earliest indicators that Mount St. Helens was going to erupt? What were the first signs that the eruption was taking place? What happened during the eruption? And then what was the aftermath of the eruption? Chronological division can be how something is made, how something is processed, how a satellite processes information could be chronological. Spatial division is how we organize things directionally. It's geography or structure. The best way to think about spatial versus topical is, could I draw my points out on a map or on a piece of paper? So a spatial division is different than topical in that there is a directional way of looking at it. An example of this is if I were doing a speech on the Eiffel Tower and I wanted to organize that spatially, I might start at the base of the Eiffel Tower, then I would work up to the central part where sort of the elevators and the stairs are, and then I would go to the top of the Eiffel Tower. Or if I were doing my volcano speech, I might say, let's look at the most active volcanoes in North America. Let's look then at the most active volcanoes in South America. Let's look at volcanoes in Asia, and then let's look at the most active volcanoes in Africa. So notice I'm doing that sort of spatial division. So spatial helps your audience kind of think about things in terms of that geographical structure. You know, if I were going to talk about Spain as a country, I might say, well, first let's look at Madrid, then let's look at Barcelona, then let's look at the coastal regions, and then finally let's look at the northern mountainous regions. That way your audience in their head, I mean, you might even use a map as your presentational aid. Causal division organizes from cause to effect or effect to cause. So if I have a thesis that says, you know, what are the ways that we end up with an El Nino in an El Nino year? And so El Nino is sort of the effect, and then I'm going to organize my speech using the causes that lead up to that effect. Or I might start out with a thesis that says, what are the causes of a certain event, and then I will use my structure to kind of lead up to the end up with that event. So a good example of how I would argue from effect to cause is what are the factors that contribute to a recession? So I would start out with recession as the effect, and then I would kind of work my way back and talk about the causes. Or I would start out with the causes, you know, and then lead up to the effect. Again, go back to your textbook because they have some really good examples of this. Speakers often use maps and diagrams to organize their topics spatially. So because this speech is going to require you to use a presentational aid, consider using a map or a diagram that's going to help organize that spatially for your audience. You can also divide your speech into a pro-con division. A lot of times with these informative speeches, because they need to be objective, that is, you don't want any bias, I might organize into a pro-con division. So, for example, I might look at the pros and cons of expanding the Supreme Court beyond 9 members. There's some talk about what we call expanding the Supreme Court, packing the court, moving it from 9 to 11 or 9 to 13. So the first main point I might talk about is, what is the Supreme Court? How is it structured? What's the current makeup? What would happen if we expanded to 11? What would that entail? Then my second main point would be, what are the pros of expanding the Supreme Court? And then finally, the cons. I always want to make sure, however, that my pros and cons are balanced and that I don't have any sort of bias in that. So a pro-con division can be really helpful to get your audience to look at both sides, and then they get to make their own decision. Problem-solution division, this is really going to be used for your persuasive speeches. So we will not do a problem-solution division in your informative speech, but you're going to start out with, what is a problem? What's wrong with the world? What is the, ill that happens in society? So, for example, I might say, right now we have a huge problem with homelessness. So I would spend a lot of time in my speech describing the problem with homelessness. Then In another point, I would offer some kind of a solution. So the audience understands that there's a problem and a solution. This doesn't work for an informative speech because the solution is inherently persuasive. You're persuading an audience that this is the best solution, or at the very minimum, for them to get involved in a solution that you're advocating. Similarly, a need-plan division establishes a need. That need typically is a problem, but we don't necessarily think of it as a problem. Maybe there's a need to improve something. Maybe something's working well. We just want it to work better. And we're going to offer that proposal of how to make it better and then show how that proposal kind of actually fixes or improves the thing that we're talking about. And then what's my plan for implementing? Again, this doesn't work for an informative speech because it's inherently persuasive. It inherently asks your audience to endorse a particular solution. The other idea that we want to think about is that throughout our speech, we're going to develop those key ideas. So we're always going to signpost the idea. You're going to tell the audience where you are in the message. And I've talked about this in your chapter on outlining has talked about this. Your entire speech is always kind of organized in a way that your audience can follow. So in the introduction, you're going to have that preview of the main points. That's your signpost. So today, in order to help you understand how paper is made, we're first going to look at this step, second this step, third this step. Then the body of your speech actually presents those ideas. And then supporting the idea, you're going to give us sources, evidence, examples. Then when you get to the end of your speech, you're going to summarize that. So we're always following this idea of signposting, stating, supporting, and summarizing. Remember, your transitions in your speech always summarize the previous idea, and then you signpost. So we're taking 2 of these 4 S's and we're incorporating those transitions. Oftentimes when I'm grading outlines, I will say this is not a functional transition because in order for your transition to be functional, always summarize. So now that we understand the first step in the stage of paper making, we can now look at the second step. Or now that we understand the pros of packing the Supreme Court, let's now look at the cons. So these ideas of key ideas help structure the entire speech, but they also help you structure those transitions. So again, the 4 S's, we're always going to signpost, state, support, and summarize. Now, we want to connect those key ideas, and this is where we talk about our transitions. We built transitions into the speech 1 because I wanted to give you an idea and kind of a sense of how those transitions work. So the first thing we want is a complementary transition. This adds one idea to another. So you could say something like, not only is it important for you to exercise to keep your heart healthy, but it's also important for you to eat a healthy diet. So you're adding one idea to another. Or in addition to this particular idea, let's talk about this. So the complementary transition adds another, and you're going to use language. Not only does this, in addition, this is another way that we can look at this. So we always want those transitions to lead us into the next point and also be summarizing. So my complementary tradition will summarize and signpost. Not only is exercising good for your heart, notice that's a summary of the previous idea. Also, we can look at how your diet helps. That then is the signpost for the next one. You might consider a causal transition. This is a cause-effect relationship. So because of this, that now leads us to this point. So if I were doing, for example, how El Nino develops, I could say, so because of the warm water that we just talked about in the ocean, that now creates problems with the jet stream. So I'm going to shift from the cause to the effect that that cause has. And again, notice I'm summarizing, I'm giving you the cause I just talked about, and then I'm signposting that I'm going to move into that effect. You might consider a contrasting transition. So now that we understand the pros of this, let's look at the cons. Or it might be clear that there are a lot of pros for, packing the Supreme Court, but there are also the same number of cons, or there are also some additional cons we need to think about. So contrasting transitions kind of, again, summarize and signpost, but in a way that contrasts those two ideas. If I were giving a speech on diabetes, I might say, so while diabetes has a huge impact on older Americans, it also has an impact on younger Americans as well. So notice I'm going to summarize and signpost, but I'm contrasting two different ideas. So the audience gets a sense that, these 2 points work together in a contrasting way. Chronological transitions are going to be helpful in a speech where you've set up a chronology, a timeline. So now that we've looked at step 1 and step 2, let's move to step 3. So now that we understand that coffee is grown, picked, and then processed, we can now look at the roasting step. So chronological transitions give your audience a way to kind of follow along. And again, you're summarizing and signposting in those transitions, but doing it in a way that is reminding your audience of that chronological progression. So that's organizing. Organizing is really important in these speeches. I stress this all the time. It's why we learn outlining. Outlining gives your audience a way to follow your speech. You're setting up those main ideas. Then you are using subpoints to develop each of those. Once an entire idea has been constructed, use a transition to take your audience to the second point. Remember, in your speeches, informative speeches, you want 3 to 5 main points. That means there's a transition between each of those main points that summarizes and signposts and that follows that organizational pattern. So the audience feels like, oh, okay, this is topic 2, or this is step 2 in this chronological process. Oh, that's right, he talked about the pros, now he's going to talk about the cons. Well, okay, he looked at North America. Now, logically, spatially, we're going to now look at South America, and then I know next is going to be Asia, and next is going to be Africa. So, hope this helps, and look forward to showing you the next video. Thanks.